Minasan, konnichiwa, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to IAG Trade Talk. It's been a very exciting Easter weekend. We've had the regulations come out from, for the first time ever, first draft of the casino regulations in Japan, issued by the regulator over there. And to help us make some kind of sense of it all is our good friend Joji Kokuryo from Bay City Ventures. So welcome once again to IAG Trade Talk, Joji.
Andrew, konnichiwa. Back by popular demand, I hope. And this time I got a haircut just for this. So,
wow, that's fantastic. I'm glad you got a haircut last week because you wouldn't have had time over the weekend, because I know what you've been doing this weekend has been poring over how many pages is there of it? It's pretty big, right?
Roughly 300. I've actually just finished it this morning, but
and that's 300 pages in Japanese too, which would probably be more like 400 or 500 in English. So and it's pretty packed on the page, I notice as well, the text. So there's a lot to get through there. And I mean, what I've been hearing is it's the obviously it's the very first time the newly formed regulator over there has issued a set of regulations of any description for casinos in Japan. And so obviously the very first time things happen, perhaps we don't get it 100% right, or there's a lot of, it's only the only draft. We've been hearing that there's a lot of, even for Japanese people, a bit confusing to understand, and we've got to just spend some time making sense of it. What's your first take on it all, Joji?
Well, after going through a lot of the material that's, I wouldn't call it very organized, but we have a lot of regulations. We have a lot of licensing criteria. We have sample forms and questionnaires. I mean, there's a lot of information. And I think putting it together into one is the first step. And, from there, we can kind of look at each one. And as you mentioned, again, it's the first time Japan has done this. Casino gaming's been, pretty much rejected for over a century here. So, getting a start on this and having something very basic to start is a really good point. So, at this point, it's not the world's most rigorous regulation, but there always has to be a step one, and I'm hoping that this is it.
Well, we've been waiting for these regulations for a long time to start to put some meat on the bones as to what's actually going to happen in Japan. And as you know, for many years, Japan has been saying that they intend to be the most rigorous and highly regulated casino gaming jurisdiction in the world. Not exactly music to the ears of an operator, but something that I think the Japanese government needs to say, given it's not a highly popular thing still in Japan. They're trying to get across the line. So perhaps before we delve into, I think we've scribbled down here half a dozen topics that we can go through. But before we get into that, just in layman's terms, your overall impression of the whole thing, like the kind of language that's used, just before we delve into individual topics, any comments on the thing as a whole, the big picture of the document? Is it needs a lot of work, or is it where you think that they've drawn their inspiration from, that sort of thing?
Well, it needs a lot of work for sure. And I don't mean this from, saying that I know all the answers, but there's still a lot of details that need to be filled out. Some questions that might come up as people go through all of these in their own areas of expertise. And with the language part, actually, you brought up a good point that the Japanese language, especially the usage of terms like etc., or the word system, whether that's an actual computer system or is that just the setup itself, I think there'll be some confusion there initially. And I think it exists internally as well. So there's gonna be a lot of brush up. And I do think that right now we just have one large document basically that has all of the regulations and standards or technical standards, but this should probably be partitioned out into different parts sooner rather than later, I think.
One of the comments that, one of the not so kind comments that I've heard from one of our associates over the weekend has been, wow, this looks like a sort of a pretty ordinary Japanese translation of an Australian Casino 101 welcome to gaming textbook in some places. So that sounds like a bit of work to be done. And I've also, very cognizant, as you say, it's their first time and there's feedback and public consultation sort too, right?
Yes, correct. So this time, public consultation period is until May 9th, which is quite long, but there's also a long holiday in early May. So that has to do with it. But I think for this time, this is not going to be the final version for sure. A lot of people say, making a public consultation period is just a procedure. But this time, I feel that we're actually going to see changes and we're actually going to see revisions to this before it's actually finalized and implemented. Which would be what, 5, 6 years from now. So I think from that point of view, as you said, this is no way near the final version that we'll see it live on the floors.
One of the things about, getting back to Japanese, now that IAG Japan's been going, we're in our 3rd year now, and we're starting to get used to the Japanese language quite a lot for an international organization, is that a lot of that Japanese in those regs there, if you just put them into Google Translate for a quick and dirty translation, at least to have some idea of what's going on. With most normal Japanese, you get a sense of what's going on, but with this stuff, it's really confusing. And then when we spoke to our Japanese staff, they're going, well, we're confused too. They're native Japanese speakers, and they're going, oh, what does that actually mean when they say that? So there's very little hope for an international operator to understand some of these regulations without deeply going in and looking and seeking some feedback and making some feedback, I think. Is that fair to say?
Well, yes and no, actually. For me, if people who know my background, it's with the gaming machine side, and especially the regulatory compliance. My first job was translating one of the Macau regulations from English to Japanese. So, again, if you know about what part you're talking about or what you're reading about, you can see where they got some of the regulations or some of the standards. So as you mentioned, like, is it Australia Gaming 101? Is it GLI 11 parts that they've kind of picked and chosen and put in certain areas? So it makes sense if you know what they're talking about. And I think that's true for any jurisdiction. At first, if you don't know about the industry, this is all just gibberish to anyone. So it's a natural thing, maybe harder in Japanese just because it's not a very internationally friendly language in terms of translation. But I think it's not always difficult to understand if you know what the topic is about.
It's been interesting. Some of our Japanese staff have said over the weekend to myself and Ben Blaschke, our managing editor, oh, what does this mean? And sometimes we have no idea. And sometimes we've been, we know exactly what that means because we understand what that terminology is in gaming or whatever. And I guess in the Japanese side, the number of gaming savvy or gaming vocabulary under savvy Japanese is still low in the country, of course. And we saw this in other jurisdictions as well. So look, let's not spend any more time on that. Let's get into it. So I've scribbled down a few things here. Let's start with something that everyone's familiar with, the 3% gaming floor space. Any more detail on that now?
Yeah, so actually it's nice to see it in writing. A lot of it was verbally spoken previously to the jurisdictions that have officially raised their hand. But things like the cage area, the restrooms, player service areas, these are all not going to be counted in the 3% gaming floor space. I think previously it was notified that, the walkways, escalators, and stairs wouldn't be part of it as well. There is still some room for interpretation on some things such as, the area needed for operation of the gaming floor, which is kind of a gray way of saying it. But I think right now we have a bit more clarity in writing, which is more important. And while this is still a draft, we know, that they're looking at real just gaming floor space. So I think that's a, move in the right direction.
What areas inside the pits? There's been some discussion about that. Is there clarification on that?
So that's exactly where, we need a bit more clarification. So again, the pit area, it's considered part of the gaming operation, but it's not exactly a gaming kind of space. So again, that's kind of the part where there has to be some discussion. I know that while it's a small space, and a lot of people outside the industry tell me that's, a few meters here and there, but if you talk to any operator in the world, they'll tell you those meters matter. So again, it's a big thing, and I think we'll see a bit more details as we go through this process.
Absolutely, especially in a gaming machine heavy jurisdiction, which people think Japan's going to be. It doesn't take much space to put another machine. You don't need many square feet to put a machine. So that's interesting. funny that you say cage is specifically excluded, is it? Because you would imagine that cage is a necessary part of gaming operations, but it's specifically excluded, is it?
Yes, so I think that for the nuance that they want to stress is that it's not just the cage, obviously. It's just a space that's needed for operation, but not actually used for gaming activities. So I think that's where they draw the line. And then there's some areas, as you just mentioned, for example, how about some areas in the pit, or even just some areas next to the table where there's signage, for example, but the signage applies to that table. Stuff like that. I think that'll be refined, and we'll get answers as people send questions.
Onto the My Number ID card, there's been much made of the fact that to get entry into the gaming floor, you're going to need to have this, and the penetration of that in Japan is quite low. I think, please correct me, you'll have a better number than me, but I heard something like under 10%, under 5% even. That was a few years ago, that number. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, great timing, actually. I think I forgot what the ministry is called, the Show in Japan. They released the data just last week that it's now 28.2 or something like that, 28% or so. But when you look at the numbers, and of course they wouldn't publicize this, but it is a bit skewed toward the older population, where about half is 60 years old or over. And so, there's still a lot of area for improvement on that front. But yes, you're right. The penetration is still quite low 6 years after, they started offering, or I'm sorry, 5 years after they started giving these out.
But still 28% is a great deal more than the last number I think I got, which was, as I say, around 10%. And 60 years old isn't old in Japan. Come on, that's just a youngster in Japan.
I hope so for my age, yep.
What about technical standards, that sort of stuff? Gaming. You're from the machines background, EGMs, slot machines, that sort of thing. Anything there for our IAG viewers for this video in the slot machine business?
Sure. I think a lot of people would be relieved to see the technical standards. It's basically stuff that we've all seen before, kind of simplified. I wouldn't go partying out at this point, but just to give some basic points like RTP, return to player for the gaming machines, it says from 90% to less than 100%. So I guess theoretically you could have a 99.9% RTP on a slot game here. Other things like the infamous, I shouldn't say infamous, but it's infamous if you're a supplier, a 3-second spin rule for the games that we've had. And, there's one interesting thing where I was looking for something unique to Japan, other than, of course, having Japanese language for help or, the screen messages. And there was a point that they stressed where the Japanese yen and the credits have to be shown simultaneously. I've actually never seen this shown simultaneously. I mean, you can switch from credits to currency, but having both at the same time is a new thing. So to be honest, that's really about the only new thing I saw. But it's interesting, and I think things will get more detailed from here. So let's not all go, throwing our hats around and thinking we can make anything.
So it's going to be a bit like a petrol pump or a gas pump for our American friends, where it shows the liters and the gallons and the price as well simultaneously as it ticks up. We're going to have our machines like that with credits and yen as well. Anything from the pachinko or patchy slot industry, anything uniquely Japanese? I mean, you just said that you didn't really find anything, but we would sort of imagine that maybe there might be something cultural or to do with gambling in Japan. Nothing like that you've been able to find so far?
At this point, there's no real comment about anything that, in our industry, we call skill games, where the return to the player can be in a range, depending on what the player does. There's no language that suggests that this is something that will be approved. It doesn't mean that this is something that's also not allowed either. But, for this type of situation, you need a regulation to get an approval. So I think that kind of space is still open, and that'll probably be considered down the line. But right now, we need to get just the regular straight up RNG straight result games down first, and we can look on from there, I think.
Interesting that there's no real contemplation of skill games. I mean, especially I think in pachinko, isn't that fishing game in pachinko absolutely famous? That some huge percentage. And interestingly, a lot of the skill, fishing was sort of a big part of skill when skill games first sort of came out. They sort of revolved around that. So I kind of thought there might be something about skill games, but it looks like they've gone for the simple approach for now. Language issues. Anything specifically about language in terms of Japanese, Chinese, English, anything in the regs about that?
Well, interesting things. If we just talk about the language, I think we're probably in Japan the first country that has made a verb out of the word casino, where you see the word casino activities, or basically, which means to bet on something that has a random result. So I think they did that to distinguish between like horse racing or any other parimutuel type of gambling, but that's kind of interesting. But for the actual issues in the regulations, as I said earlier, the overusage of etc. When you're tightly regulating something, you can't use etc. Even if you say what it is. There's one example in the summary, so I think a lot of people saw it, where it says mergers and etc. So this is about when your business changes, your company changes. But mergers, etc., includes mergers, splits, and business transfers and such. So things like that, I mean, what does that actually mean, and how can you regulate it when it's not that clear? Stuff like that, I think those will be ironed out as we go forward. It's actually a type of government language used quite often here. So it's quite confusing when you see a direct translation in English. But basically, if it's English, you just list all 3 points, and that's what they mean.
Anything about signage or language to be used in the gaming floor on machines, signage, that sort of stuff? Any comments there or not?
Sure. The standard is going to be Japanese and English. Obviously, Chinese is not required, but when you consider the type of customers that most operators would be targeting, Chinese would also be very useful language to have, probably a requirement considering the market.
Yeah, effectively. A bit like how you often see Korean signage in the Philippines, because that's such a big feeder market for them. Anything, so sort of going forward from here, what's the next steps in how we go forward now that we have got this first look at the regs and everybody's been poring over them this weekend?
Well, we're going to see a lot of changes. And I think when I say changes, not exactly to the regulations, but I think we'll see additions, maybe is the better way to put it. Probably the regulations will be reorganized. And as I mentioned before, that, this is a first-time process, and the public commentary and also some kind of advisory comments that they receive, or the Casino Regulatory Commission receives, will matter this time. And there's plenty of time. 5 or 6 years at the least to get this right. So other than the things about licensing criteria, which need to be set beforehand, I think we'll see it more down the line.
Joji, I think we might have lost you for a couple of seconds through that answer. So apologies to everyone if the internet sort of bummed out there for a couple of seconds. But all right, well, so who do you think, last sort of question, who do you think will be making comments on these? I mean, anybody can make comment, right? So potentially operators, vendors, even, watchers of this, the media, public interest groups in Japan. I mean, typically these public processes in Japan, who makes commentary on these public consultation processes?
Now, that's a good question. It's usually people with a stake in the industry or in the business, as you mentioned. There is actually quite a lot of regular, people that also comment when they have questions, or maybe they're just against something. But I mean, personally, I think I'll make sure to comment on some points. Let's say if I wanted to become a dealer in one of these casinos, I would probably want to make a comment about why there's no tipping allowed, for example. So I think everyone has their own kind of motives for commenting, and usually, as you mentioned, it's bigger groups or companies that might make comments. But I think this time around, we'll see comments from not just locally, but from an international audience or international commentators. because it is a very international business and there's a lot of things involved that need to be cleared up.
And how to, practically speaking, how do people make comments to the regulator?
So you go to their website. This is probably the weirdest plug I've ever done, but you go to their e-government website. It's all in Japanese, obviously, and you just plug in basic details, your comments. They do publicize some of the ones that they've used as well. I'm not sure if they actually use it or not, but the ones that are very informative or that bring up good points, they are publicized. I'm not sure if they publicize everything, but again, it's quite transparent, contrary to common belief. So it's an interesting process.
Very good. Well, thank you, Joji. Arigatou gozaimashita. And we will follow this with great interest as it rolls out. If any of you have any comments that you want to make on the regulations, feel free to email us here at IAG. Go to our website, click on the About page, and all our email addresses are there, or go to our LinkedIn page and make comment on the story. We've already run a story this morning about the 9 games which are allowed, typical casino games. We didn't touch on that. And there'll be much more to come from IAG on this. So we'll see you all next time. Thank you again, Joji.
All right. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。
See you next time.